Thank you. It's good to be with you. The good news is it is easier now to go visit places. The bad news is we don't really get to visit them. So there's no question that we are living in this year that I would call COVID-19 is an epochal event. I think we will talk for years. We will talk about BC and AC, not AD, but AC, before COVID and after COVID. I think we're giving material to historians for the next 100 years to write about this period. And of course, it's too early to speculate what the post-COVID era would be like. But I think it's not too early to start drawing lessons from COVID-19. And the lesson I want to focus today is on efficiency versus resilience. Just a very quick introduction to myself. I grew up on a kibbutz in Israel. You can see on the right top corner. Was a very nice place to grow up. At age 10, my parents bought me a collection of 10 volumes of the young technologist. And even though I'm coming from a family with a 10th generation of rabbinical tradition, it switched me to the scientific path. I was just a nerd until about 15 years ago when I was asked to lead a study of software off-sharing. And that led to my being selected as editor-in-chief of communication of the ACM. And I started developing a keen interest in computing and society. And you see the talk today will be exactly this interface of computing and society. So let's go back to the crisis. So it's important to understand it's not a single crisis. It's at least a quintuple crisis, a fivefold crisis. Of course, underlying all of this is the public health crisis. We are in the middle of a pandemic. It is far from over. The numbers are rising again everywhere in the world. The exit path is very, very uncertain. So, I mean, everybody's talking rough winter ahead of us. And that, of course, had driven an economic crisis. So in the spring of 2020, the Youth and Food Bank distributed every day 1 million pounds of food to people who just cannot get food otherwise. What you see here are lines of people waiting for the food. And you should be struck by saying they have cars, but they don't have food because they probably lost their jobs and they don't have, the cash flow is constrained and they have to go to the food bank and wait hours to get food for the family. And oil and gas prices have plummeted. Now this may sound like good news, but one in Texas, this means people lose their jobs. But also towards the end, I'll come back to climate change. And low energy prices are actually very bad for climate change because it takes away the economic incentive to go to alternative energy. In the United States, we also had on top of this a social crisis. There historically had been deep inequities and injustice in American society. And this has all been exposed and everybody's nerves are raw from the pandemic, so things have exploded. And of course, we have election tomorrow. No one knows how we're going to navigate this election and the post-election period. So I would say is we are on top of this at the political crisis as well. Now, one question is, how did we get here? Was this a total surprise? Were we caught flat-footed? Why were we not ready for the pandemic? The answer is, it really was not a surprise. You do a little research and you find here is a testimony by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in 2006, testimony to the Senate, preparing for the pandemic flu. So people already knew that a pandemic like that can happen. It was only really a matter of time, because, you know, especially when we have now people, humans and wildlife living closer to each other. It was only a matter of time because a new virus will show up for which we don't have traditionally any immunity. So why were we not ready? And that's partly the question that I will try to answer. But I want to remind you a period that now looks like it was years ago, March of this year, where the phrase that we kept hearing was flatten the curve. And what did flatten the curve refer to? the fact is the epidemic always proceeds in some kind of a bell shape because how eventually the virus run out of new hosts. People either die or develop immunity, however it happens, and epidemics always taper off. We had, of course, horrible epidemic, the Black Death, and maybe a third of Europe died, but epidemics always eventually taper off. But the argument was that we need to flatten the curve. And what was the idea of flattening the curve? It was not that we will reduce necessarily the number of infection, but we will lower the peak. Because at the peak, we don't have the capacity to handle so many cases. Here is an article from a business publication, Market Watch, from April of this year. Nurses are wearing garbage bags as they battle coronavirus. It's like something out of Twilight Zone, because we learned a new acronym, PPE, personal protective equipment. We did not have enough PPE suits. So nurses had to wear a garbage bag to protect themselves. And in fact, mortality in the early phases was very high, precisely because hospital like in New York area and in northern Italy and Spain did not have enough capacity to give good treatment to all the patients. So that was one argument why we need to flatten the curve, which some places have done better than others. And the fact that we're not ready and we had to go to extreme measures inspired William Galston, who is an economist from the Brookings Institute in the United States, to write a column in a Wall Street Journal in March of this year. And his title was "Efficiency Isn't the Only Economic Virtue." And he wrote, what if the relentless pursuit of efficiency, which has dominated American business thinking for decades, has made the global economic system more vulnerable to shocks? And he goes to explain the dichotomy between efficiency and resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover readily from illness, depression, adversity, or the like. And he says efficiency comes through optimal adaptation to an existing environment, while resilience requires the capacity to adapt to disruptive change in the environment. So the more efficient you are, the more optimally you adapt to the environment, the less flexibility you have to adapt to changes, and the less resilient you are. So there is a tension between, a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. And other people have said something similar. Thomas Friedman, a columnist in the New York Times, wrote in May of this year, "How We Broke the World." And he said, greed and globalization set up for disaster. And what I find really ironic here, that Tom Friedman, remember, he wrote "The World is Flat." He was the prophet of globalization. And now he writes, over the past 20 years, we've been steadily removing man-made and natural buffers, redundancy, regulations, and norms that to provide resilience and protection when big systems, be they ecological, geopolitical, or financial, get stressed. We've been recklessly removing this buffer out of an obsession with short-term efficiency and growth, or without thinking at all. So again, he said, in the name of efficiency, we've sacrificed resilience. He doesn't use the word resilience, but it's right. Oh, he does use resilience and protection. So this point of the trade-off between the inefficiency of efficiency was, as far as I could find doing research for this, I found it for the first time in an article from 1975 called on the efficiency, titled on the inefficiency of being efficient. And the point that Goldberg is making in the article is if you are only focused on efficiency, then you're looking at the problem from a very narrow perspective. And therefore you only consider a very narrow range of solutions. And there will be solutions that may not necessarily be the most efficient, but they have other features and you will ignore them. And so he said, at the end of the day, he said, at the bottom line, is being too focused on efficiency is inefficient. Let's take one example. Just-in-time manufacturing, JIT, also known as lean manufacturing. So this, I remember this arose in the 1980s when business people suddenly made a brilliant observation that keeping an inventory is very expensive. Why? Because you pay for the part and the parts are sitting in the warehouse idle. So this is not productive money. You have to maintain a warehouse You have to build it and maintain it. You need people to move things into the warehouse and out of the warehouse. This is all very inefficient. How about we eliminate the warehouse and the parts will arrive to the manufacturing line just in time? That's the idea, just in time. Indeed, for example, companies such as Dell became famous, not as necessarily innovating in terms of technology, but innovative in terms of logistics in reducing the expenses as much as possible by being very, very efficient. The problem with just-in-time manufacturing, of course, is it assumes best-case logistics. Everything has to arrive really just in time. What happens if there is a delay? It doesn't arrive. Well, the line has to stop because you don't have enough parts to do it. And indeed, the Wall Street Journal has been running a sequence of articles called the COVID storm, trying to understand what happened. Why were we caught so flat-footed with COVID? And one of these articles, why there are still not enough paper towels, or you could even say a toilet paper. And the picture you see here is a picture of a large store, Costco. It's a big retail store, and this is the paper section, paper product section, and you see it's empty. And it was like that. I shopped there. It was like that in March. And the article said blame lean manufacturing. A decades-long effort to eke out more profit by keeping inventory low left many manufacturers unprepared when COVID-19 struck. So we are so focused on efficiency, we had no capacity to change. We had zero resilience. And a month later, they wrote about hospitals and asked the same question. Why did COVID overwhelm hospitals? And the answer, a years-long drive for efficiency. Health systems have kept a tight rein on employee numbers and expanded outpatient care, helping their finances, but making them less prepared for a medical crisis. Again, we are very efficient and we sacrifice resilience. You can find this tension between efficiency and resilience in other areas as well. Let's look at finance as an example. So you may remember that in 2008, the financial system in the United States and then in the world almost collapsed. And in fact, one firm, Lehman Brothers, had to declare bankruptcy over a weekend practically. And you may ask yourself, how did it happen? After all, these firms specialize in risk management. This is really what finance is about. It's all about risk management. So how come they were not ready? And people did look at it. And there was an article in Vardi magazine a few years later, and the title was The Formula That Killed Wall Street. And it said Wall Street did have risk model. And there is one very important formula, or risk model, called value at risk. I want to know that with probability, let's say 99%, I will not lose more than, let's say, $100 million, because I think I can absorb such a loss. And they developed sophisticated mathematics. This is called the Gaussian copula function, developed by David Lee. And of course, we can spend an hour just talking about what does this formula mean. But it turns out the formula worked really, really well for the 99%. For the black swan event, the formula did not tell you what is your risk when the market goes really, really sour. And so this black swan event almost sunk Wall Street because they were very efficient, but they were not resilient. And we can ask this question, we can take this lens of efficient versus resilience and look at many facets of our life. We can look at governance. Is democracy efficient or resilient? Winston Churchill, 1947. Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said, democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms have been tried from time to time. Generally, democracy, we know it's very, very inefficient. I mean, right now, Congress, the US Congress wanted to pass some kind of a second financial stimulus plan, and they couldn't agree. The Democrats and Republicans could not agree on this, and people are suffering. So clearly, democracy is very inefficient. Generally speaking, it is more resilient because there is less of a risk that one person will make a wrong decision. More people are involved in the decision making, you end up with more robust decision making. Of course, one may question whether, especially the federated democracy of the United States, federal government, and 50 states, is this a resilient way of handling pandemics? And so far it looks like, no, we need to think how to organize and prepare ourselves better for pandemics. Let's go back and take a look. Remember this picture of the cars waiting for food. Hundreds of cars waiting hours for food. Again, we have built a non-resilient society in the United States. And this is not new. This has not been just exposed now. In 2016, the issue of precarity or living precariously came up. And there were some studies. The first study showed that 47% of Americans, if they have an unexpected expense of $400, maybe the car brakes went bad, and they need to replace the brakes in the car, and that's about $400. They don't have $400. If something bigger went bad, maybe the transmission went bad, and they have to replace it, and it's $1,000, 2/3 of Americans do not have the capacity to handle it. What will they do? Who knows? Some of them may go to family or friends, and some will lose their job. If they lose their job, they may lose their house as well. So that's partly what we saw in the spring of this year was the precarity of American society. And Adam Serwer, in an article in the Atlantic, wrote about it in June. It didn't have to be like this. The desperation of US workers in the aftermath of the coronavirus was a product of a series of policy decisions and missed opportunities. And I'll come to the economics, back to the economics, towards the end of the talk. So how does nature deal with this trade-off? This trade-off of efficiency and resilience also exists in nature, as I'll explain in a minute. And in 2016, when I was editor-in-chief of CSEM, we published an article, Sex as an Algorithm, the theory of evolution under the lens of computation. We struggle what kind of illustration to put on the cover page when the title is Sex as an Algorithm. And at the end, we decided with tongue-in-cheek to just put a pink cover, and we thought it was funny, but we managed to offend quite a few people. So be careful when you think you're funny. But the article is a very serious article. What was it about? So Livnat and Papadimitriou say we have borrowed two types of algorithms from nature. One is simulated annealing. What do you do in simulated annealing? You do a sequence of small mutation. So you are following kind of bacterial evolution just by mutation. And once in a while there is a random step to get out of a local optima. People have tried to simulate nature even further and add crossbreeding, hybridization of chromosomes to mimic sexual reproduction. So you have mutation and crossbreeding. And it turned out that the genetic algorithm, our computational experiences, genetic algorithms are inferior to simulated annealing. Simulated annealing is a better algorithm, generally speaking. And so the question is, why would nature choose sexual reproduction as the almost exclusive way for reproduction in animals? Bacteria has something more complicated, so I won't talk about bacteria. They have mutation, but they also have sideway exchange of genes. But at least animals is almost exclusively sexual reproduction. But if sexual reproduction is inefficient, why has it become so dominant in nature? And the answer that Livnat Papadimitriou offer is that efficiency is not the only lens that nature considers. Sexual reproduction offers you greater genetic diversity. What does it mean? It means that the individuals in the species are not very efficient always because they're less optimally adapted to the environment. But because there is more genetic diversity, the species is more resilient. So again, sex as an algorithm gives us greater genetic diversity and more resilience. So both efficiency and resilience can be viewed as optimization, forms of optimization. Efficiency is short-term optimization. Resilience is long-term optimization. What does nature prefer? Nature prefer long-term to short-term. Why? Because nature cares about survival. The T-Rex, okay, the T-Rex is a very efficient hunting machine, but the dinosaurs were not resilient. As Darwin explained, it is not the stronger of the species that survives, not the most intelligent, it is the one that is most adaptable to change. So again, nature focuses on resilience and not on efficiency. It turns out that people have looked at this also in the context of biological complexity. And there is a paper in Science in 2002, and it talks about fragility, which is the opposite of robustness. And it has a theorem that says the net fragility is a conserved quantity. And the paper is a deep paper in control theory. And I was not able to fully digest the paper. But Vijay Kumar, who is a control theorist, explained to me that basically say if you optimize for the faster time scale, you lose on longer time scales. And Shankar explained to me this instance of, you can call it no freelance theorem. If you optimize on efficiency, you're going to lose on resilience. There is a trade-off between the two. So I want to go back now and look at, in computing, this trade-off between efficiency and resilience. This is volume 1 of the Art of Computer Programming. This is the opus magnum of Don Knuth, the closest we have to patron saints of computing. So what is this sequence of, this is volume 1, but they were all the way to volume 4. Knuth himself planned to do 7 volumes, but right now I think he's stuck at volume 4. So what is Art of Computer Programming about? It's all about efficiency. And in fact, Wikipedia explained that analysis of algorithm means analysis of complexity, the amount of time, storage, and resources needed to execute them. So in analysis of algorithm, our focus is always been on efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. I studied algorithm, it's always about efficiency. But in 2013, David Ackley wrote an article in CSCM, and he wanted to look at another aspect. He called it robustness. So, you know, when you talk about resilience, you find the 3 R's. You know, the 3 R is famous for for elementary education. It's about reading, writing, and arithmetics, the 3 R's. My 3 R's are resilience, robustness, and reliability. They are all slightly different, but they are in the same sphere of things, so to speak. So David Ackley said, let's look at sorting algorithm. Bubble sort, we consider typically not a good algorithm. It's quadratic in the worst case and average case. Merge source is a good algorithm, n log n. Quicksort is quadratic in the worst case, but it behaves well on the average, n log n. And David asked, what about robustness? And he introduced a model in which you do comparison, but on 10% of the comparison, you give a random answer. So what you get is not something that you come with an unsorted list, and the list that you output at the end is not completely sorted, almost sorted. And so the question is how well sorted it is, how far it is from being perfectly sorted. Turn out that quicksort gives you better sorted outcomes in the presence of errors. So quicksort is robust. I'm sorry, bubble sort is robust. I misspoke. Bubble sort is robust, but merge sort and quicksort are not robust. Now, why is it? We typically think of bubble sort as a very bad sorting method. And from the point of view of robustness, it turned out to be the best one. What's going on? And the answer is because bubble sort does redundant comparisons, and it gives us more resilience. And this point of redundancy and resilience, we'll come back to it. It's a very important point. So I want to show you another example how algorithms of the non-resilience of algorithm, the non-robustness of algorithms. So incredibly important algorithm is PageRank. So PageRank is an algorithm that Larry Page invented, and it is used to to give the result of a search. So if you remember when we started doing search engines in the 90s, before Google, we had like Alta Vista. You did a search and you got many, many results, but you had to go page after page after page to find one screen after the other to find good, relevant result. And then PageRank suddenly come and you got very good results. Very quickly, you got very good results. So how did PageRank work? It has a beautiful idea. If you have a website that many other websites point to it, then that website is important. And if you have a website that many important websites point to it, that website is very important, and so on and so forth. So PageRank works by analyzing the graph structure of the web. And it gave fantastic result, and it launched Google, that it became a mammoth company, incredibly successful company, because it's all built on the basis of this good search engine. But it turns out that other people develop technology called search engine optimization. And the idea is, let's suppose I'm starting Italian restaurants in Houston, and I want my restaurant to float to the top of the search. How will I do that? Well, I create lots of fake websites and fake links pointing to the website, and my restaurant will float up in the ranking. So PageRank was a very good ranking algorithm, but it was not resilient. Today, the patent has expired. It's unlikely that Google still uses PageRank. We don't know exactly what they're using. Their search result ranking algorithm is a trade secret, because as soon as you publish the algorithm, people try to do, again, search engine optimization. So now they make it resilient by making it obscure. So here is another example of efficiency and resilience. So in 1983, Larry Stockman invented an algorithm called PAC, probably approximately correct. It shows up in the connection also of Valiant adopted it to learning, PAC learning. But the idea of PAC is to do randomized computation and give you an approximate answer with high confidence. So there are two parameters. Epsilon is the possible error, is the error tolerance, and delta is the confidence. And you want to compute up to an error epsilon, factor of 1 plus epsilon, with a certain confidence. But Stockman's definition has a gap. It doesn't say what happens in the tail event. How big is the error in the tail event with the probability 1 minus delta? And if the error there is very large, then it will skew the expectation. So in 2016, my collaborators and I defined something called strong PAC. And we say it's not enough that you have error epsilon and confidence delta. You also have the expectation should be, your result should be correct in expectation. Why? It is more resilient. So we focus on this issue of resilience, and I want to look at other aspects of resilience. For example, I want to talk about the aspect that I think is very important. Its aspect is friction. And in 2010, I said our discipline is dedicated to reducing friction. In the name of efficiency, we want to eliminate friction. Latency must be eliminated. Bandwidth must increase. Ubiquity should be universal. Our goal is to reduce the friction of computing communication as much as possible, all in the name of efficiency. Friction sounds like it's against efficiency. In fact, Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, what was the goal of Facebook? Frictionless sharing. We now know that frictionless sharing is not a good thing. It's not a utopia, it's a dystopia. There are all kinds of impact that Facebook, adverse impact from the Facebook algorithm. We including what we call filter bubble. It shows you only what you want to see, so you never see dissenting opinions. The proliferation of fake news, extreme content. Now we're talking about how Facebook is destroying democracy, all because of frictionless sharing. It's too easy to share on Facebook. How do I know I'm on Facebook? I share too much. It's too easy. But it's not only in social media where you see that having low friction is a problem. In about 10 years ago, we had something called the flash crash. The stock market crashed suddenly. I mean, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 600 points in 5 minutes. What happened? There was a follow-up investigation, and the argument that this was caused by high frequency trading also known as algorithmic trading. So suddenly one algorithm decides to sell, that triggers other algorithm to make a sell order. And because they're all doing it very, very fast in microseconds, poof, the market can drop precipitously. Now, what is the argument for having such high-speed trading? The proponents say it makes the market more liquid. They want the market to be more liquid. But even people from the industry say, no, this is just about money. It has no social value. There's no reason to search for infinite speed in trading. In fact, some economists have studied this and concluded that the high frequency trading arms race, everybody tried to be a bit faster than the other one, is a symptom of flawed market design. There's no reason not to put speed bumps on the market because systems without frictions are known to be unstable. And that's what happened today with the stock market. It's very unstable. But you can even take it to other domains to the problem with reducing friction. So in 2018, Jenna Birch wrote an article in Washington Post asking, why is it so hard to turn a Tinder date into a relationship? So Tinder is a dating app where, again, they make it to be as frictionless as possible. You see a picture, if you like it, you swipe to the right. If you don't like it, you swipe to the left. And she wrote, despite the swarms of matches over the years, I've never had an app that turned into actual relationship. And this, her personal experience has been verified by academic studies. Indeed, couples that meet online are less likely to stay together. But the answer is not very difficult. There is a song, easy come, easy goes, no hard feelings, darling, no regrets. Everybody understands. If people are invest less in a relationship, they're less invested. If it doesn't work, oh well, big deal. I'll go back to the bar and swipe again. And because they are less invested, it has less lasting power. So what does it mean philosophically? So at Rice, we have the engineering quad, and I'm in computing sciences in one corner. In the other corner, not very far from me, just about maybe 200 meters, is the mechanical engineering departments. So imagine that I go to my colleagues mechanical engineering and tell them, look, in computing, we've taken as a goal to eliminate all friction, all. You should do the same. You should eliminate friction from all machinery. They would tell me, you're crazy. Friction is bad in some places, good in other places. Do you want your tires to have no friction? To the contrary, we design tires to be high friction because we need them on the road to have high friction. So the challenge is, Aristotle have said getting angry is easy, but getting angry at the right people, at the right time, to the right degree, for the right reason, that's hard. So friction is you have to put the right amount in the right place in the right time. You have to think about it in a holistic way. Friction is not bad or good per se. It depends. And we have not developed such nuanced understanding of friction, where to put it and where to take it away. So, for example, we've made email so easy to send. So all of us send too much email, receive too much email, and spam because there's no friction. And we need to figure out how to welcome friction back into computing. So David Ackley, who looked at robustness of sorting algorithm, concluded that we have a very narrow lens on algorithms and on software in general. And he called it CEO software. CEO is not for Chief Executive Officer. He said it's for correctness and efficiency only. He said we are so focused on correctness, the software should do what it's supposed to do, and on efficiency that we ignore everything else. And he said we need to develop a broader, more quality metrics that will also consider what happened when things fail, what happened when you have imperfect execution. Here is a fantastic example of an algorithm that was too focused on efficiency. So 737 is an old Boeing 37 is a working horse of Boeing for many years now. And Boeing decided they need to modernize it. But they didn't want to design a new frame. So they designed new engines, more powerful, more efficient, but they wanted to put them on the older airframe. Well, the new engines on the older frame caused some instability. And the instability were beyond what pilots could compensate for. But Boeing said, no problem. We can have now fly-by-wire. We can have a computerized control, automatic pilot that will detect the instabilities and correct them very, very fast. And indeed, when it works well, it's very, very efficient. But the control system depended on one sensor. If one sensor failed, the control system did not have enough information, and the pilots were not able to handle instability. So there were 2 crashes, hundreds of people got killed, years of aircraft grounding. Not clear yet. Boeing is not out of the wood. It's not yet clear whether Boeing will ever fully recover from the disaster, where they focus so much on efficiency in terms of fuel and time to market at the expense of safety and resilience. And let's look at security as another aspect. So a few years ago, I wrote about the cybersecurity problem. And a well-known security researcher wrote to me, you don't understand how security works. So I said, explain to me. And he wrote me, I'm quoting verbatim from his email. First, somebody builds a thing and it's super useful. Then eventually someone else comes along and finds a vulnerability. Then security becomes a part of engineering process. Just like we need to make sure our code does not have bugs that makes it crash, we also need to make sure that our code does not have bugs that can be exploited for bad purposes. Turn the crank for enough years and eventually security gets better. So in other words, you build it for functionality and features, and security is an add-on later. And in fact, we saw it. We are all on Zoom, and hopefully we're all very well behaved, but I've heard horror story by people who taught on Zoom and got what now there is a verb for it, Zoom bombed. So Zoom added security after the added features. They did not start, but let's build a secure video communication infrastructure. Security last, not instead of security first. And so here we are, about 75 years into the computer age. The ENIAC started in 1946, so next year will be the 75th anniversary. And if you look at the Turing Award, you can think of them as the milestone for accomplishments in computing over the 75, or not from the beginning, but starting, I think, from around early 60s. ACM has given 4 Turing Awards in cryptography, which is a very important part of security, but only a very small part of security. No Turing Awards be given in cybersecurity. If you ask people why, they would say, what is Turing Award worthy in security other than cryptography? And so we still do not know how to build secure information system. And the issue is not just that maybe you have identity theft. Identity theft is a nuisance, but now you can buy at least insurance for this. You know, there are ways to deal with it. I'm worried about attacks on vital infrastructure. The power system, the power grid is susceptible to attacks. The financial system is susceptible to attack. And you would think that we would be in a incredibly urgent about it. I don't have a sense that our community is saying, oh my God, what have we done? We have created such a vulnerable infrastructure. People just go on, write papers. I don't see the security community having a sense of crisis around the issue. And underlying this, I think there is a philosophical attitude of, especially of computing technology. So let's compare ourselves to transportation. So the 20th century was the century of the automobile. The Ford Model T, all of the manufacturing line in 1908. And very quickly people discover automobiles, people get killed in car crashes. But we've taken it very seriously. We have made automobile much, much, much safer. We have reduced mortality, I think, by car crashes since over the past over 100 years, at least, I think, by a factor of 50. In fact, in the United States, we have National Transportation Safety Board. They issue standards, and they're binding standards. We have nothing like that in the area of cybersecurity. We have not taken it as seriously. And whenever you go and you tell people in the tech industry, we need regulation to ensure better cyber security, they push back. And they will tell you that regulation stifles innovation. And you can think of innovation is, again, efficiency, 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 but we are neglecting resilience. And the industry has not been able to address this on its own. And I think it's time for governments to get involved and start establishing some standards that company must follow. The same thing happened with car company. In fact, car company will tell you that regulation, in fact, is a source of innovation because they're all forced to adhere to government standards. They all have to innovate in order to meet these standards. If they have to do it on its own, it's not clear they would have done it on their own. I want to go back to economic efficiency because it's I asked the question, why were we not ready? There were warnings. It's not there were no warnings. The answer was, we didn't get ready because it was going to cost money to get ready. It wasn't going to be cheap. It's going to cost lots of money. So, for example, President Trump cut the CDC budget. And in February of this year, he said, it made sense to cut them. We can hire doctors when we need them. So the Vaccine Safety Office, now we all want to make sure that we have vaccine that we can trust. And many people now, especially, I can tell you, I don't know what I will do if Trump gets reelected and they said we have a safe vaccine. I'm not sure I believe them. I'm not sure I trust them. After they closed down, there was a Vaccine Safety Office, they closed it down just a year ago in 2019. So was efficiency ahead of resilience. So let's dig in a little deeper. What is economic efficiency? So there is Wikipedia, but there's also Investopedia. Okay, and this is, you find lots of detailed economic information in Investopedia. And they define what is economic efficiency. It means goods and factor of production are distributed or allocated to their most valuable uses and waste is minimized. And furthermore, free markets advocates argue that through individual self-interest and freedom of production as well as consumption, economic efficiency is achieved and the best interests of society as a whole are fulfilled. So they promise us a panacea, have a free market, and that will guarantee efficiency and optimality. We can have the best of all possible worlds if we just get government out of the way. That's the free market argument. And you can go to, however, to real economic theory and macroeconomic 101. And the most fundamental theorem is so-called first welfare theorem. So if you want to understand microeconomics, free market, you go to the first welfare theorem. And I won't state it very technically, but it said that under certain technical assumption, a free market where everybody, again, people are free to trade and set prices and decide on supply and demand, the market will converge towards competitive Pareto optimal equilibrium. And this is what they mean by efficiency. Efficiency means it's in equilibrium. Nobody can improve the situation without someone else getting worse. So the theorem says the free market produces economic efficiency. It doesn't say anything about optimality. It does not. The theorem is not about optimality, only about efficiency. So it's a fair question. Does efficiency guarantee optimality? If you end up with such a competitive Pareto optimal equilibrium, does it really serve the interests of society as a whole? And Papadimitriou, together with Kotsopias, looked at this question, and they decided to take a concept from algorithm analysis, where we look at online algorithm, and we talk about the approximation ratio, or and this is how well do online algorithm approximate the best offline algorithm. So they say, what happened if you take the worst possible equilibrium, Nash equilibrium, and you compare it to the social optimum? You look at the total social utility, but you look at the best and worst Nash equilibrium. And they call it the price of anarchy, because there is no overall government that pushes the market towards one equilibrium or the other. So it will end up in some equilibrium. And the question is, what happens if it ends up in the worst possible equilibrium? And what they show is that the price of anarchy can be arbitrarily high depending on the complexity of the system. The larger, the more agents are in the system, the higher can be the price of anarchy. So this is a formal proof the economic efficiency does not guarantee the best interest of society as a whole are fulfilled. It's not an argument necessarily against free market, but it takes away some of the mythology that somehow free market serve the best interest of society. No, it does not. No theorem, the theorem does not say that. In fact, we have a theorem that says that the cost of anarchy can be very high. But in a follow-up paper, they want to look at a deeper question, which is, do we even obtain efficiency? And what they realize is the way a market reaches an equilibrium is analogous to local search. Why? Because one person lowered the prices, another person increased demand, another person reduced supply. These are all local steps. And everybody does local steps to improve the situation locally. So it is analogous to an algorithm with local search. So they ask themselves, if we have such a system and we want to do local search, how long is to compute an Nash equilibrium? And what they show is it can take exponential amount of time. So in other words, markets actually are very unlikely to ever reach equilibrium, because if it takes so long, something will happen. Circumstances will change. Price will go up. Supply will, weather will be bad weather. There will be drought. Something will happen. So the market is really never in equilibrium. We really do not have efficiency. We do not have optimality. So the free market may be a wonderful engine of innovation and initiative, but in the end of the day, it does not guarantee efficiency and optimality, not to mention the resilience we saw is often ignored. It was a famous movie in the 1980s. It was called Wall Street. And Michael Douglas was playing Gordon Gekko, a Wall Street financier, and he gave a famous speech. You can find it on YouTube. Greed is good. Greed, for the lack of better word, is good. Why it is good? He says, well, this is Adam Smith's invisible hand. Everybody acts greedily, and somehow we end up with a global optimum. But every computer science students know that greedy algorithm gets stuck in local minima. And that means that you need some systemic intervention. This is what simulated annealing does. It takes a systemic step to push us out of local optima. In this case, I would argue right now, in terms of cybersecurity, we seem to be stuck at the local pessima, not local optimum, but local minimum. And you can consider a market failure. The market somehow does not price security the same way it prices other functionality and features. And I don't see, without some systemic intervention, how we get out of this local minimum in cybersecurity. In fact, interestingly, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of a very important article by Milton Friedman, who wrote in 1970 that the social responsibility of corporations is to have profits. This led to what became known as shareholder value dogma, which was the dogma for 50 years of American businesses. And the New York Times had a retrospective on this, which they have titled "Good is Good, except when it is bad." And they quoted many business leaders. And they quoted, for example, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, a major cloud computing company, who wrote, "I did not agree with Milton Friedman then, and the decades since have only exposed his myopia. Just look at where obsession with maximizing profit for shareholders has brought us. Terrible economic, racial, and health inequalities, and the catastrophe of climate change. It's no wonder that so many young people now believe that capitalism cannot deliver the equal, inclusive, sustainable future they want. You ask now, you do polls among young people in the United States, and support of capitalism has declined dramatically." In fact, Nick Hanauer, who is a billionaire, but I would say is a billionaire with a social conscience, recently wrote an article in Time magazine, and they have looked at income distribution in 1975 and 2018. And what they have shown is how the 1% has gained significantly at the expense of the bottom 90%. So they show that in 1975, the top 1% earned 9% of the income, and the bottom 90% earned 67% of the income. But 2018, you can see that the top 9% are about the same, from 25 to 28%. Top 1% have increased their share to 22%, and the bottom 90% have declined to 50%. They've calculated this means that $50 trillion went from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. $50 trillion. I cannot resist putting this joke here. I have a joke about trickle-down economics, but 99% of you will never get it. So classical economics talk about homo economicus. And this is where agents, the human agents, are supremely rational. They do only one thing, maximize their utility. Now, on one hand, behavioral economists have documented extensively how irrational humans are. But I think more fundamentally, Herb Simon in 1956, Herb Simon was a Nobel Prize winning economist and a computer scientist. And he argued for something called satisficing, which combines satisfaction with sufficient. And he said, instead of optimizing, more of what we should do is settle for good enough outcomes. We should have a goal, and once we reach the goal, we should set good enough. And in fact, many of us do that. You know, we don't try to, in fact, if you have a friend, and all your friend is trying to do is make more money, make more money, make more money, you probably think your friend is a jerk, not a nice person. And most of us said, no, we have enough money. Now let's focus on other parts of life. And this is less efficient, but is more resilient. And I'm going to become a little technical now for a couple of minutes, just to give an example how you can take this idea of satisficing and turn it into a research topic in computer science. So these are 3 slides and they're a bit technical, so don't worry, we will just go over them quickly. Together with a PhD student of mine, well, she's now graduated, we look at discounted sum games. So these are what we call game. The 2-player takes moves on a game graph, and every node of the graph, it's a state, and they receive a reward. But it's an infinite game, and the way that you aggregate the reward is using discounted sum. The future is value less than the present. And this is a classical problem. The optimization problem is to find a strategy for player 0 that will maximize reward against player 1. And 25 years ago, Zwick Patterson showed that this can be solved in polynomial time using value iteration. So the question that we wanted to ask is, what happened if you want to make the system more resilient? And you say, in addition to maximizing reward, I also have temporally extended goals. I have some constraints on temporal behavior. For example, every message sent is eventually received, or maybe every message received must have been earlier sent. These are things that, to me, that, you know, I said, I do not want to take arbiter. All plays are not legal plays. There are some rules. And what Chatterjee et al. Has shown in 2017 is, in this case, you lose optimality. Once you add hard constraints, you don't have optimal strategies anymore. So we said, what happened if instead of looking for optimality, we look for good enough strategies? That is to say, you have a threshold, and you are happy if your reward is bigger than the threshold, and you still are subject to hard constraints, which are the temporal extended goals. And then we're able to show that there is an algorithm, a polynomial time algorithm for integral discount factors. So all I really want to give as impression is that I think we can take this concept of resilience, and bring it into our computing, into our research program in computer science. I gave one example, and we need to think about other settings, how we define resilience and robustness and reliability, and so on and so forth. So let me try to bring this to conclusion. So we saw that many things in COVID-19 did not work. The world has been collapsing around us. On the other hand, here I'm giving you this talk. I'm here sitting at my home in Houston. I'm giving you this talk in Stockholm. I've been working from home since mid-March. Last time I went to a grocery store was mid-March. I'm teaching now, the semester, and we're in the middle of the semester. I'm teaching from home. My students are learning from home. We have medical appointments from home. The internet held up, even though there was a huge, suddenly, think of what happened in Zoom. Who knew about Zoom in February? And suddenly, Zoom was everything in March. How did it hold up? Well, there's one key principle, redundancy. Redundancy is the key to resilience. Redundancy is inefficient, but we have known in computing, going back to the 40s, error correcting code. How do you make sure that you can transmit in unreliable communication medium? You add additional bits for error correcting code, redundancy. Von Neumann wrote an article in the 50s. How do you build how do you build a reliable organism from unreliable cells? And the answer is redundancy. And in some areas we understand it. You want to have a resilient financial system, make sure that the bank have redundancy of capital. It's very inefficient because its capital is not productive, but it gives you resilience. All banks now are required to have redundancy of capital. And it's, to me, just amazing irony how, why are we able to survive? Imagine that COVID happened even 20 years ago. I don't know what would have happened. The world would have collapsed, because one way we are still able to maintain economic system is by using the internet. Why the internet being so robust? It goes back to the 60s. In the 60s, we had the Cold War. And the worry is that how do we have deterrence between the two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union? And the doctrine was called MAD. It was a MAD idea, mutually assured destruction. If you attack us, we'll attack you, we'll destroy each other. It's crazy, let's not do it. That requires that you have, first of all, redundancy of attack capacity. So the United States, for example, developed what's called the nuclear triad, which are the land-based missiles and air-based bombers and the nuclear submarines. But that was not enough. You also need a robust communication system that can survive a nuclear attack, to have credibility of a counterattack. And that's where the idea that we need to build redundancy and have a distributed rather than a centralized system to have a resilient communication system. So technologies that were developed to survive a nuclear war allow us to survive COVID-19. I find this historical kind of a confluence quite amazing. So I want to close up. Resilience is a fundamental but underappreciated societal need. Both computing and economics need to focus more on resilience. It turns out that people are not very good at people are not very good at getting ready for such eventualities. So for example, car insurance. So I have car insurance. Why do I have car insurance? I'm required to have car insurance. In order to renew registration for my car, I have to buy car insurance. So getting ready for such event, creating resilience requires societal action. It doesn't happen by itself. People and markets are not ready for such low probability event. And we must remember the COVID-19 maybe just be the dress-up act, the warm-up act for a much bigger challenge, which is climate change is coming up. In the West Coast, we have been seeing wildland fire burning more and more from year to year to year. We have more acreage burning, and this is clearly driven by climate change. There is a book that came out a few years ago. It's called The Collapse of Western Civilization. And it's a science fiction book that looks from the year, I think, 2050, look backwards and told us how the world how civilization will collapse because of climate change. It's a very scary book. So I want to wrap up. There was a book that came up in the mid-80s by a German sociologist, Ulrich Beck, called it The Risk Society. And his point is society have grown more connected, more technological, and more globalized. And this all create more risk, lots of invisible risks. And in fact, 2 years later, Chernobyl happened. And Chernobyl, again, I'm sure it was felt in Sweden, but it could have been much worse. It could have been that Western Europe will become uninhabitable because of Chernobyl. Adam Tooze wrote in a foreign policy magazine, the question so vividly exposed by the crisis such as Chernobyl and the ongoing coronavirus pandemic is how to navigate this world where we are facing such globalized risk. And the answer is very clear: resilience, resilience, resilience. Farid Zakaria, a columnist of the Washington Post, wrote very recently, the pandemic has upended the present, but it's given us a chance to remake the future. Let's not blow it up. We have a chance of remaking our society with focusing on resilience. Let's focus on building a resilient society. Thank you very much.